Welcome to episode 178 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm going to share how you can act rather than react to student behavior and stop losing so much class time when kids are off task. Visit truthforteachers.com to get the transcript or find our new Truth for Teachers podcast community on Facebook. You can share your thoughts on the show there and reflect with other listeners in our private group. This episode is sponsored by ViewSonic Education. They are the creator of ViewBoard, an interactive whiteboard for the classroom, and MyViewBoard, which is a digital whiteboarding app. Together, they help teachers create engaging lessons at home and present them in the classroom. Search the internet, open your favorite apps, and play educational videos, all from your digital whiteboard. Finally, it's a solution that teaches the way that you do. To learn more, visit viewsonic.com/education. One of the frustrations that I think has been common to every teacher in every location across the history of time is that of having your instruction interrupted by someone who's not paying attention. And I lead with that because I think it's important to have the larger context. Students being off task is not a problem that is unique to you. It is not necessarily something personal. It's not something caused solely because of you. And it's not something that you can ever solve 100%. There is no classroom in which every student is totally engaged every minute of every lesson. You want to make sure that you're reaching all kids, of course, but it's impossible to reach all of them at all times. So I think the goal is to engage every student, but not necessarily all at the same time, and certainly not every minute. At any given point in your day, at least a few are going to be tuning out and allowing their minds to wander. The same people who are telling you that you should have 100% engagement at all times are unable to get 100% engagement among teachers in staff meetings and workshops. So take any pressure that you feel in this area with a grain of salt. We are all aiming for 100%, but no one's getting that. We can engage them all, just not all at once, all the time. Since we know that some off-task behavior and lack of engagement is a given, how can we best respond? I want to clarify before I go further that I am talking about normal classroom disruptions like daydreaming and whispering, talking, playing around, doing things to make the other kids laugh, calling out, and that sort of thing. Please don't listen to this episode with your most challenging student in mind and think, oh, this will never work. This kid throws desks. This kid is not neurotypical and needs more support than I can offer. That's a different situation and a different podcast topic. I'm talking today about the little interruptions to your instruction that happen all day long. The things that can feel like death by 1,000 paper cuts. I'm talking about the behaviors that almost every kid in your class exhibits at some point during the day. Even without any extreme behaviors in your classroom, an excellent lesson that should take 30 minutes can take 45 if we're responding to minor disruptions and off-task behavior constantly. And I know I have certainly found myself in that trap. One group of kids would be off task during whole class instruction, and I would stop the entire lesson for a 30-second lecture to everyone about paying attention. Or a pair of students would be playing around during independent work, and I would jolt the entire class out of their concentration by yelling across the room to them. Or one student would be giving me attitude, and I would derail the whole class's lesson for an entire minute in a standoff, which would sometimes culminate in an office referral, and that took up even more instructional time as I called the office and filled out the paperwork. Given that the average class has an off-task behavior happening somewhere in the room constantly, these inefficient responses were sometimes repeated every couple minutes. If I fell into that pattern, I would be constantly interrupting myself and pulling kids' attention away from their work. It's already hard enough to get kids to focus, and the last thing that I wanted to do was derail their thinking. So why did I make those choices? Mostly because I was exhausted, and I wasn't taking care of myself. I didn't have the energy or the patience to respond to kids the way that would have been more effective for them. So when I started to feel frustrated and disrespected, reprimanding and lecturing in front of the whole class was just the easiest response. And because many of the other teachers in my school did things that way, I didn't really question it. This was the status quo. That changed for me one day when I interrupted my own instruction yet again to give yet another lecture to a student about paying attention. And I heard another child sigh. "Come on," she said. "I just want to learn this." I looked into the face of that child who was rarely off task, and I realized how much instruction she was missing out on, not because of the other kids, which is who I normally blamed. She was missing out on instruction because of the way that I responded to the other kids. I can complain all day long about how certain students' behaviors were disruptive, and they were, but I had the power to choose my reaction. I could choose to respond in a way that created an even bigger distraction, or I could minimize the interruption. I began to change my focus from eliminating all behavioral issues to maximizing learning time. And this is a major mindset shift if you really unpack it. The goal most of us have is to eliminate behavioral issues, to have no interruptions or distractions at all. That's what we want, right? But that's an impossible goal. We're never going to reach that. We're going to experience failure all day long if that's what we're aiming for, and we're going to get frustrated. Shifting the goal from getting rid of off-task behavior to instead maximizing learning time is very different. Now the focus is on something realistic and something you can control. Disruptions are expected and anticipated and planned for. They don't throw you off your course because they are part of the course. You only have to respond in a way that helps you make the most of your instructional time. When the goal is to eliminate interruptions, you feel like you have to address every single one of them every single time and really belabor the point and instill fear in kids so they won't dare to be disruptive again. But when the goal is to maximize learning time, it feels more comfortable to set your ego aside for this greater purpose of keeping the majority of the class on task. It takes experimentation and a lot of practice. But over time, I learned to make my default response to misbehavior something that maximizes learning time. For example, when a pair of students were playing around during independent work, I walked over to them and would hold a conversation in a low voice so that the rest of the class didn't notice. Now, that's not exactly rocket science, right? It's nothing that you haven't thought about before, but that's not what we normally do. It's a lot easier and more satisfying to just shout across the room, "Stop talking." But when I did that, it made every kid in the class look up from what they were doing and try to find the person that I had just yelled at. I was creating a bigger distraction than the kids. So being really intentional about not taking that easy way out and instead of going over to them privately would make a big difference. Another example, when one group of kids was off task during whole class instruction and I was trying to teach, I would have the class do something quick and meaningful, like a turn and talk to summarize what I just said, or read this next paragraph briefly to yourself. And then I would walk over to the group of off-task kids and correct the behavior quietly. In other words, I got the rest of the class engaged in doing something that kept them focused on the topic while I was addressing the behavioral issues of one child or one group, instead of making all the kids sit and listen while I did that and distracting them even further. A final example, if a student gave me attitude during a lesson or challenged me in a way that I just couldn't ignore, I avoided a standoff that would escalate the situation and pull the entire class's attention away from learning. And instead, I'd say, "I'll deal with you on that later. Right now, let's get everybody prepared for this activity." And then move immediately into my next directions for the others. Once the rest of the class was engaged in learning, I could then issue the appropriate consequence privately to the student. When I was in my feelings, these were very hard things to do. It would feel like putting the student in their place and letting them know that I was in charge was the most important thing. But that absolutely isn't the most important thing. The most important thing is helping as many kids as possible meet the learning objectives for that lesson. That's why they're in my class, to learn the curriculum, not to learn what happens when they disrespect Ms. Watson. When I made the learning time the priority and only addressed the misbehavior once I knew I could do so without compromising the instruction of the rest of the class, it made all the difference in how much we were able to get done together during the day. Now, this does take planning and practice. Since we know that kids will be off task, it's a guarantee, it's normal behavior, it's to be expected. We have to plan our responses in advance. We have to choose how we want to act when students are disrupting our lessons. Because it's not an if, it's a when. In a lot of customer service situations, representatives are prepped for common scenarios that they will encounter. So take a helpline for a major hotel chain or a cable company or something similar to that. They usually have a manual that they're working from that helps them depersonalize their responses and not become emotional. And they do this in part because, like teachers, they are often subjected to emotional abuse from the people they are responsible for helping. They will have people cuss at them, talk over them, not listen, argue, and so on. Being prepared for negative responses is part of the job. This is the radical acceptance that we talked about in episode 176, right? We're not saying that that kind of behavior is okay. We're simply accepting reality instead of working against it. The reality is that kids will do the same 10 or 15 annoying, disruptive, and sometimes disrespectful things all day long in the classroom. So instead of trying to just power through a lesson and hope that it goes well, and then reacting to misbehavior, we can instead choose our actions in advance. We can have a playbook or manual that we're working with. Just like those customer service reps, the best companies have them practice those scenarios in advance. So the moment that someone becomes argumentative with them, it feels like a familiar and therefore non-threatening scenario. The human brain is going to go into fight or flight mode whenever we feel threatened. And that's how we end up screaming at a kid for whispering to their friends while we're teaching. We have a goal that we need to achieve, and we feel threatened by the possibility that we won't be able to achieve that goal because of their interruption, and we react out of that fear. But when you have a chosen action that you've practiced repeatedly, your brain will no longer default into believing, this is a threat and I have to respond. Instead, it will feel like, okay, it's not a threat. We know what this is. We've experienced this. This is normal. We have a plan for this. We have a script for this. And you can go into sort of an autopilot response mode. And I'll give you an example of that. I had a science teacher in high school who never once argued with us. She would give us a direction to, let's say, complete an assignment independently. And of course, we'd question her. Why do we have to do the whole thing? Can't we skip this part? Can't we have an extra day to do it? Can't we turn it in late? Can't we talk while we're working? All the things that students have always said to their teachers. But after the first couple weeks of school, she stopped answering our questions. And instead, she would smile and she would say calmly, I am firm, fair, and consistent, in that order. When she said that, it would drive us nuts. We would sigh, we'd roll our eyes, and she didn't respond to any of that either. If anyone dared to keep pushing her, she'd just repeat the same line again. I am firm, fair, and consistent, in that order. I still remember it to this day, obviously. She could not be baited, and she did not defend or explain herself. Her response to us was always aligned with her teaching methodology. It wasn't based on whims. It wasn't based on her current mood. It wasn't based on her anger or her frustration with us. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily an ideal response or the perfect line. And I'm not saying you should never try to help kids understand your reasoning. That can be really important too. But when kids are just complaining, do we have to? I don't want to. How come I'm being punished and he's not? Don't get sucked into an endless back and forth that's going to derail your whole lesson. You can easily lose a quarter of your instructional time going back and forth with kids. Instead, choose a response in advance that's going to be appropriate for your teaching context and your students and your personality. You might want to have a couple of go-to lines or facial expressions. Practice that over and over, like a customer service representative preparing for an unpleasant phone call. Most of the frustrating stuff that they deal with, like the frustrating stuff that we deal with, is fairly predictable. It's the same type of behavior and complaints over and over again. And if you can have a default response prepared for those scenarios, you will have a lot more energy left when you do face an unusual situation that requires more emotional labor. Shifting your focus from eliminating misbehavior and interruptions to simply maximizing learning time by planning how to act rather than reacting to problems is a game changer, I promise. This is going to keep you from exploding over minor things and overreacting. And it's going to keep you from wasting class time with lectures and arguing. If you want to stop feeling like you're expending energy all day long and yet barely getting through your lessons because the kids aren't really learning, examine your response to student behavior. You are responsible for your own choices, not student choices. And you're responsible for making sure your needs are met to prevent overwhelm and exhaustion so that you can show up for kids in the most healthy way possible. Self-care is absolutely critical when it comes to having the ability to regulate our emotions and act rather than react. Your essential self, your true self, is patient and kind and compassionate. And when you respond in ways that are not like that, consider why. Do you need more sleep? Are you hungry? Do you need a break? Tune into your own needs throughout the day and recognize when you need to use your lunch break, for example, to just sit in a quiet, dark room and decompress for a couple of minutes. Give yourself small breaks throughout the day to recenter. Just 30 seconds here and there while the kids are working. Breathe, clear your head, refocus on your purpose. Have a meditation practice like we talked about in episode 173 called Breathe for Change, Teacher Tools for Well-Being and Mindfulness. The idea is to take care of yourself so that you can show up the way that you need to for kids. Your takeaway truth for the week ahead is a quote from George Bernard Shaw, who said, "The possibilities are numerous once we decide to act and not react." When you feel cornered or trapped or baited by your students, like you have no choice but to respond to them with anger or punishment or lecture, remember that your choices are limited when you're reacting to them. But the possibilities are numerous when you decide to act instead of react. When you choose an intentional response based on who you are and how you want to feel, instead of just an impulsive response to the energy of others. Have a great week. You can do this. And remember, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be worth it.